Can River Thames win the Preakness for Todd Pletcher? Let's stick around and discuss. Hi, everyone. Matthew DeSantis here with NYRA Bets, here with the Preakness Spotlight Contenders series, where we look at River Thames and take a deeper look at this Todd Pletcher trainee and his chances at the 150th Preakness Stakes. Now, before we get to that, I want to remind everybody to press that like button and subscribe to NYRA Bets YouTube today. Subscribing is entirely free of cost, just notifies you when new videos drop on the channel, including race previews, full card analyses, handicapping and betting tutorials, weekly programs, specialty shows like this one, and so much more. Listen, we're not just about the Triple Crown. There's plenty on it. Don't worry. We're also going to have a preview of the Peter Pan Stakes. We're going to do a cap in the card for Saturday at Belmont at the Big A. We're going to have a lot of other content outside of just the Triple Crown. Obviously, we're getting ready for Saratoga. We're getting ready for the Breeders' Cup after that. Listen, it's a year-round sport, and we have year-round content for you right here on NYRA Bets. All right. Well, listen, let's dive in and discuss a little bit more about River Thames, a horse that I think is pretty intriguing and has definitely some positive, might have some drawbacks, but it is a horse that qualified for the Kentucky Derby. I think that's an important thing to remember. This is a horse that was eligible to run, and Todd Pletcher and Connections decided to skip the Derby and instead go to the Preakness. And I think a lot of that has to do with his pedigree and kind of the distance limitations that he likely was going to have going 1.25 miles. Now, you might say, well, it's only 1 mile and 3/16. It is, but there's a lot of different dynamics in the Preakness that we'll talk about that make it substantially different from the Derby, particularly for a horse like River Thames. So, listen, this is an interesting horse, though. Almost beat Sovereignty in the Fountain of Youth. If you remember, Sovereignty got up in the last jump right before the wire and won that race over River Thames, who finished second. And then I thought finished a very competitive third in the Bluegrass, showed some things that I think you could view as a positive moving forward for this Preakness Stakes effort. But let's talk a little bit more detail about River Thames, trained by Todd Pletcher. The jockey, we're going to have to wait and see. First 3 career starts, jockeyed by John Velasquez. Last time out, jockeyed by Irad Ortiz Jr. Could go back to Johnny V, could stay with Irad. The reason it's a little bit of a question is because Irad Ortiz Jr. rode Gosker for Brendan Walsh last time out in the Lexington. Well, that's a horse that's also going to likely be in the Preakness. So Irad's going to have some choices to make, and depending on that, obviously that could then impact where Johnny ends up on a potential mount coming back to ride River Thames. I mentioned those 2 notable efforts. It's important to remember River Thames is still a very inexperienced horse. No 2-year-old foundation at all. Does not break his maiden does not debut, let alone break his maiden, which he doesn't debut until January. And then you look at the pedigree. And I think this is the big thing with River Thames, maybe why people like him or dislike him, and I think why he's pointed more towards the Preakness. Maclean's music out of a discreet cat mare. The Maclean's music is just, it's so much more of a sprint influence. And you really do wonder if a horse like River Thames would have gotten the 1.25 miles, particularly with in what ended up being 18 other horses in the Kentucky Derby going fast fractions. This is a horse that likes to be very close to the early pace. And I just think that would have been too much. Now you might go, well, we're only cutting back a half furlong. We're going 1 mile and 3/16. True, but you're dealing with a smaller field. And more importantly, you're dealing with a speed favoring track. And Pimlico, particularly on big days, tends to really hold up front end speed. And as a result of it being a smaller field, the early fractions are not as diabolical. So you can track the early pace, I think, a lot more effectively at a race like the Preakness, and it leaves a horse like River Thames the ability to maybe get a little bit more distance as a result. That tracking trip, it's nice. You can get a horse into a nice, comfortable rhythm, and they can kind of relax a little bit down the backside. And again, when a horse is relaxed, that often allows for them to get a little bit more distance. And that's always one of the keys. That's actually one of the reasons why I always like Johnny Velasquez on younger horses, because he tends to be able to get them to relax. By relaxing, they're able to get into their stride a little bit more. They're not exerting as much energy. And because of that, they can get an extra furlong, an extra half furlong. So listen, River Thames has proven to be a very good horse at 1 1/8 miles. He almost closed and got up in time for the Bluegrass. He was really closing there and doing a nice job. So he showed he can get at least that 1 1/8 miles, stretching out another half furlong. Again, under the right conditions, I think makes some sense. But let's talk a little bit more details about this horse. And again, very inexperienced horse. New York bred. So we're always rooting for that up here with NYRA and NYRA Bets. We love to see our New York breds do well. Spirit of St. Louis winning the Turf Classic last week was a real thrill. But one of the things that really stands out about River Thames is his speed figures. They're incredibly consistent, but in some ways he kind of runs the same race over and over and over again. And, 94, 92, 95, 94. Now, it depends. If you like River Thames, you could go, he's super consistent. He's never run a bad race. And he's still a young horse and could move forward. If you dislike River Thames, you can kind of go, I know what he is. And I don't know if he's got another level up to him, that he's just kind of going to run that same figure basically every single time. As with most things, I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And he's shown the ability to run really big races. And he's been stretching out continuously throughout his entire career. So he debuts at 6 furlongs and really makes short work of the competition with Lasix, then steps up and wins an allowance optional claimer, again, very easily that day, and going a mile, the one-turn race down Gulfstream Park. Then we switch off Lasix and we go to the Fountain of Youth Stakes. We're going a mile and a 16th, and he runs a really big race. Like I said, Sovereignty gets up in the shadow of the wire for the win. And in a lot of ways, that race was also an educational effort because River Thames had the lead in the stretch, took over from Neo Equos, and like I said, had the lead in the stretch. And all of a sudden was kind of looking around. You could kind of see his ears were flicking a little bit. And even Pletcher made reference to the fact that it looked like he was looking at the infield screen at Gulfstream Park when he was coming down to the wire, maybe lost a little bit of his concentration and focus. And that's what allowed for Sovereignty to make that big move to get up there. So those are some of my kind of thoughts on River Thames in terms of maybe explaining that performance. And then you come back in the Bluegrass. Now, granted, Keeneland tends to be a pretty speed favoring track as well, though not always. And they ran really fast fractions that day because East Avenue was up on the lead, going pretty fast. And River Thames sat in kind of that third position, few lengths off the pace, really closed well. And, he and Burnham Square were really closing on East Avenue. And I think that the positive thing for River Thames is that Bluegrass came back stronger than I think people thought it was going to. Burnham Square ran a very competitive 6th in the Kentucky Derby, and even East Avenue, I believe, held on for 8th, if I'm not mistaken. So a lot of people thought, that was a bad race. That was a bad prep. I wasn't impressed by anybody coming out of that. The fact that Burnham Square and East Avenue at least acquitted themselves pretty well, they acquitted themselves better than, you could say potentially the Arkansas Derby, in terms of Sandman, Coal Battle, Publisher, horses like that finished, much further back. So it's interesting. River Thames, I think, does get the benefit of the doubt there, and also showed the ability to still make up ground and get stronger and pass horses going that mile and an 8th. Now, again, he got a really strong fraction that day with East Avenue going fast. The good news for River Thames is there should be a decent amount of speed, even if it is only 2 primary horses up on the front end. Clever Again and Rodriguez are going to be your top 2 speed horses. River Thames is going to slot in behind those 2. Now, we have to wait to see post position draw, etc. But expect for River Thames to be sitting in that 3rd position again. That's kind of where he likes to sit. I honestly think that that's where Rad Ortiz Jr. is at his best, is in these tracking trips. That's where I always feel like he has a better sense of how to get a horse a winning trip from those spots. And so there's a lot to like about River Thames. The question is, can he go from a 95 buyer to 100? Can he take that next step? Because you're probably going to need to move forward with a horse like Rodriguez, who's already run a couple of triple digits. You have a horse like Clever Again, who's run a triple digit. If journalism goes, at the time of recording this, it's not confirmed yet. We'll see. But he's obviously got now 3 triple digit buyer speed figures. So you have several horses in this race who've run 100 plus. You probably are going to need to at least run a 99, 98, 99. You're going to need to take a step forward from your career best. Can you do that? I think he's got the right sort of trip. I will say that. If you think that maybe Rodriguez and Clever Again go at each other a little too much, maybe you have some questions about a horse like Clever Again getting the mile in 3/16, having just run a mile last time out, and maybe you think Rodriguez, if he's pressed a little too much, or maybe he gets outbroken and kind of gets to the, has to rate off of a horse like Clever Again, and when Rodriguez rates, he's really not the same type of horse. So again, maybe you think some of those things might happen. River Thames could kind of sit a perfect trip between a potentially embattled front 2, depending on the sort of fractions they set. And again, he can sit close. I know it looked like he was sitting a little more mid-pack in that Bluegrass, but the reality is that he was sitting well back because there was such a strong pace from East Avenue, who had cleared out the field by a couple of lengths. So when you look at his other efforts, he likes to sit that stalking trip. He can sit third, he can sit second. He's got a lot of versatility for Irad. So there's a lot to like about River Thames. I do think the legitimate question is the mile and 3/16. Is he going to like it? I was encouraged by the Bluegrass more than I thought I was going to be. And then the other question with River Thames is, you know, can he move forward from the 94, 95 sort of figures? Can he get faster? And he's got every opportunity to do that. He's only making his 5th career start. You certainly don't want to write the horse off as just being a mid-90s Beyer speed figure horse after 4 career starts, particularly with somebody like Todd Pletcher, who's now had a couple of extra weeks to work on his conditioning, get him really tuned up for this race, having last run at Keeneland. So, Todd's as good as anybody about getting horses to stretch out. It's why he's had so much success at the Belmont when it was going a mile and a half, when it was at the Belmont Park, and when it will continue to go to a mile and a half when we get back to the Belmont Park. But River Thames, like I said, I think a pretty interesting horse. And I say that because Rodriguez is going to be a top contender in terms of the betting public. If journalism goes, those are your top 2 choices. After that, I think River Thames is in the conversation. I think a horse like Gosker is in the conversation. And I think a horse like Clever Again's in the conversation. And so those 3 kind of suddenly start to ascend a little bit. But I think as a result, if journalism and Rodriguez are taking all the money, you can get a decent price on a horse like River Thames, maybe 7-2, 4-1, 9-2, in that range. And if you're able to get that sort of a price on him as a 3rd choice, maybe a co-4th choice or something like that, that's not a bad bet, because he's going to sit the right trip, and it just depends on what your pace scenario says. If you think Rodriguez clears and just wires the field, then I completely understand that logic. If you think he and Clever Again maybe go at each other a little too much, or Clever Again keeps Rodriguez from getting the trip that he wants, then I think a horse like River Thames can be the beneficiary. But he's a very intriguing runner, and I like the fact that Pletcher is kind of stealing a page out of Chad Brown's book of skipping the Derby, going to the Preakness, and having a horse coming in fresh. And I think this is one, like I said, I was impressed by that ability in the Bluegrass to gain strength going a little bit longer, doing that mile and an 1/8. So I think he can get that extra half furlong despite the pedigree. Once the horse starts showing you who they are on the track, that tends to be kind of the reality of the situation. Do I think he's going to be a mile and 3/16 type of horse forever? No. I think long-term he's a miler to a mile and a 16th type of a runner. But I think under the right conditions at Pimlico, speed favoring track, right sort of pace set up, he can absolutely get this distance. All right. Well, that's going to do it for our spotlight preview on River Thames. Like I said, make sure to press that like and subscribe button to NYRA Bets YouTube today. My name is Matthew DeSantis, wishing you a great and profitable day at the races, and reminding you, friends, it's now post time.